I'm Jeanne Johns, and welcome to Risk Matters, where we share our experience in high-hazard industries with the ultimate goal of eliminating industrial accidents and keeping people safe. Today, we'll be talking about the civil explosives industry, an industry that actually is based on safely handling explosive materials. And it plays an incredibly important role in producing all sorts of materials that we need for everyday life, and doing so at a much lower energy input requirement than the mechanical breaking up of the rock would need. Given the inherent explosive material handling required, safety is core to leading an explosives company. And if you'll pardon the mining pun, it's a rich vein of safety learnings for other industries. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest today, John Rathbun, who I met when I was CEO and Managing Director of another explosives company, Dyno Nobel. John is the CEO and President of Austin Powder, a global leader in civil explosives, and, as importantly for this podcast, the chairman of SafeX International, an organization dedicated to sharing learning from safety events and information for the global explosives industry. John has over 38 years working inside of Austin in a host of roles ranging from product manager, research and development, oversight of the South American businesses, and before his current role as managing director of the international portfolio of companies. He's a good friend and someone I have a tremendous amount of respect for, and I particularly admire his passion for safety. And with that, I'd like to welcome John Rathbun.
Thanks, Jeanne. It's a pleasure to talk with you today.
So, John, I wanted to start today's podcast with focusing on the explosives industry itself. And while not everyone may be familiar with the industry, I would suggest that most people can see that it's a high-hazard one. I personally joined the industry after a long career in both oil and gas and petrochemicals, but your career has been focused on the industry. So, John, how did you choose it, and how do you think of the industry's inherent risk?
I was first introduced to the mining industry through my father, who was a mining engineer. He worked for U.S. Steel. And as a young man, I decided to follow in his footsteps and go to mining school. And that's where I got introduced to the industrial explosive business. And like many folks who are in the industry, I'm very thankful to have found this industry and have found it both fascinating and a satisfying place to work. Regarding the inherent risk, I see our industry very much through the same lens as the airline industry, where safety is a foundational given if their business is going to be sustainable. I often say to folks, explosives are safe, but they're very unforgiving, which is just like flying. If you follow the rules, do the training, know the procedures, design the equipment appropriately, etc., then we will stay between the guardrails of safety and sleep well knowing that our fellow colleagues and our neighbors are not in harm's way. However, if we disrespect the rules or the procedures or take shortcuts, then we indeed are now in the red zone and all bets are off, and it's just roulette at that point.
That's a great analogy, John. And we'll come back to this unforgiving nature a bit later. But first, I wanted to explore your personal journey on safety leadership. I mean, did you always have your deep affinity to keeping people safe, even when you were a young man, or did this grow over time?
Yeah, I think we all care about people, but my first experience with the gravity of our industry and our product line came out of an event after I'd been in the company for 15 years. And I had heard up to that point some stories of past incidents and their impacts on the workforce and the families, but I never really truly comprehended or understood what was the result of an incident. So we had one. I jumped on a plane out of instinct and I flew over to the site, and it was a horrible situation that I came upon where we had a worker who had been a lone worker who had been so severely damaged by an explosion of a primary explosive that we knew he was going to die, but it took several days for him to do that. And during this time, we spent time with the family, time with the workers, and it was during these moments, particularly with the family in their living room, surrounded by the emptiness, the sorrow, and we couldn't talk, we didn't share the same language, but it was there that I understood my essence of purpose and what my role was. It was really an epiphany moment for me that crystallized my comprehension of what my role needed to be. And that was to just be relentless on rooting out unsafe practices and, more importantly, creating a culture built on deep safety beliefs.
That's a heartbreaking story and deeply moving. And unfortunately, many of us have our own personal story when it comes to safety, when it actually moved from this concept to something much deeper and more personal. Mine was as a young supervisor at a refinery when one of our dredging contractor employees was killed while working off our dock. And when I boarded the vessel in the aftermath, it was a truly shocking situation. And looking into the faces of his workmates and feeling the impact the incident had had on everybody around him, it just really brought home to me the human toll of industrial accidents. And one wish I have for this podcast series is to help today's leaders learn from these painful stories and experiences, and hopefully to help them avoid having to experience it themselves.
Yeah, I think that's great, Jeanne, and I agree that sharing and telling these stories honestly and passionately helps authenticate the true core lessons that we learn from every one of them, and it helps guide us when we're confronted with different priorities and human behaviors.
John, I wanted to go back to what you mentioned earlier, this unforgiving nature of explosives. And, as an industry, safety requires controlling substances that are actually specifically designed to explode under the right conditions. So when you think about that, how do you ensure that explosive materials can be handled safely?
I think everyone who walks past the plant gate as a new employee, they get it. Their family told them before they went to work there, be safe. And they know they need to learn and listen and understand the rules, and they really want to be safe. Same for the people on the bench at a mine or in a quarry. They know that there's risk there, and they start with genuine caution. And we all benefit from this as a natural respect, and it's part of our job to make sure that we keep that respect high and that we support it, continue to train about it, talk about it, and make sure that we are auditing to verify that we're doing what has been vetted as a safe practice.
I love that idea of respecting the hazard. People, start by wanting to be safe and following the best safety practices. But, we know that can go astray. And so what do you look for, John, as a warning sign when maybe that's not happening on a location?
Yeah, great question, Jeanne. And I think we all have different triggers that we are looking for. For me, it's housekeeping is a big one, and cleanliness. We can use that as a measure or barometer for an organization that is around a particular operation. Are they really keeping things dust-free? Are they going to manage their foreign objects out of the process? Is the operation free of homemade tools or extra tools that you find? Another one that is key is, can the folks who are right there in that particular place articulate why they are safe and what are the protections that are around them that keep them that way? We call this the basis of safety, or BOS. And what are the risks that may cause a detonation? We use the acronym FISH to help us remember what they are, what those conditions can be that can lead to a detonation for a particular product. And every product has a different behavior, but is it friction, impact, static, or heat? And if we've trained the workers, and maybe more importantly the supervisors who surround us to keep us safe, then when one of them sees a deviation from those protections, we can then correct it quickly.
A lot of great suggestions in there, John. And I always like looking at housekeeping as well. But I particularly like to focus on the remote corners of a facility. Often when you show up at site, they've actually devised a path for you to follow. And it's important to get off that beaten path and actually see what's really happening, kind of when nobody's watching. And I also love the BOS, the basis of safety concept, which is very analogous to the oil and gas industry when we talk about the controls we put in place to manage a hazard. In fact, I borrowed from my BP days and implemented at Dyno Nobel critical control verification, what we call a CCV process. And that's where the supervisors, operators, and even when I went out in the field, I would look at those critical controls that are put in place to manage a risk and to make sure that they're there and they're functioning as expected. And it's important not just to talk about the equipment and the processes and the materials, but also to remember that there's a lot of human elements that go into staying safe. So you mentioned earlier about leaders and keeping the respect high for the hazards. So one of the things I've always struggled with is how do you keep the vigilance high, all the time, day in, day out? Can you talk more about that and the importance of vigilance?
Yeah, you can't say this enough. Our folks throughout the company, they must be trained to feel comfortable to say stop if something's not right, or something, it doesn't smell right, or a bearing is not making the normal noise, or it's making a very different noise. Anything that's different, they should raise their hand and say stop. If they discover vagrant dust in a place where it shouldn't be, or it should have been cleaned up and it wasn't, they need to stop and ask questions. We say run it up the flagpole for review and consultation, and if they were wrong, that's okay. We just need to continuously build that into our organizational muscle, that we stop and investigate, adjust, course correct if needed, and then restart.
Yeah, I'm absolutely a firm believer in preaching, stop the job. And I'm always surprised at how difficult this can be, and I think that, deep down, a lot of times the workforce really believes that as leaders, we do want them to kind of get the job done. And that's why emphasizing the stop the job is so important, to make sure that people recognize that safety does come first. And sometimes I find that stopping the job can be most difficult amongst the most experienced people who see themselves as experts and have worked there a long time. So when you think about, keeping people safe and respecting the hazard, how do you keep it high with this particular group of people?
Well, I'm thankful that we have a whole team of folks who are long in the industry and learned in the topics of what keep us safe. But I've also learned that we shouldn't assume that the folks with the longest tenure are going to be the ones who behave according to the rules or the procedures all the time. Sometimes, in fact, we've learned that they're the first ones to make the shortcuts, as they're the most comfortable with the products or the processes, or they believe the perceived risks. These are the folks who are, the younger folks are working for, and they're watching and they're learning from them. And so it can be a real hazard and a roadblock toward improving the company's safety culture. And the incident that I shared above was a lone worker who's one of the most experienced operators at the site. And he theoretically knew the most about the characteristics of the material he was handling and the procedures that were written to follow them when handling it. But we learned through the investigation that he wasn't following the procedures. And then subsequently, we learned that all the folks, and there were like 4 or 5 others, who were handling this particular static, impact-sensitive material, each one of them had their own way to manipulate it. And all were the most experienced people we had on that site. So we went back to this group and we brought in some outsiders and we sat them all down and we wrote a new procedure that everyone agreed to, and then they committed to follow.
Yeah, I can relate to this experience. I was with BP many years ago, and they have a huge and extensive safety data globally. And I went through it to look about, what kinds of people get into safety incidents, which get hurt. And I wasn't surprised to see that a lot of them were relatively new to the industry or to the company. But it did surprise me a bit that actually, at the other end, the most experienced employees were also high risk. So, John, we've just been talking a little bit about thinking about your own organization as far as safety red flags when things may not be happening the way you like them in the field. But one of the things that really did strike me when I joined the explosives industry, that it was a very dispersed nature of the workforce. There's a large number of remote sites where we store explosives, and there's a lot of individual mines and quarries where our people work. So there's sort of twin hazards that come with this nature. One is, how do you know that people are working safely when no one's watching? And how do you handle working on a customer location? So I'd like to start with that first one. When no one is watching, how do you get comfortable that people are doing what you want them to and staying safe when they don't have direct supervision?
Yeah, first, I think we have to somehow connect to the core of our lives and to these people that indeed they're loved by their families and their families depend upon them, and that that's something that we really cherish. And that isn't about our co-worker relationship with them at all, but at a higher level, we want you to return home every day unharmed to the folks who love you and depend on you. And so that's foundational. We want you to follow the rules, and that's why. And then there's a cultural overlay that also has a big impact for lone worker roles and assignments or environments. And as you mentioned, we have lots of remote locations where products are stored and used, and those are the hardest because it's a situation where the individual is the only one watching, and those are the hardest to monitor, obviously, and therefore you need some other inputs of connection. Technology can help, like cameras and tapes and things, and you can use those for auditing, or you can do physical auditing when you're there, but that's probably the most important in terms of regular training and in discussions with the worker about the importance of doing it safely, making sure that he understands why he's doing what he's doing.
Those are great points, John. And I do think that when there's less supervision, it's all that more important that inherent belief in safety, that they really do understand not only what it takes, but knows that that's what's expected of them. If we move on to the customer impact on safety, and I'm sure you've given that a lot of thought. Austin's well known for its customer intimacy and very strong relationships with its customers. And many of our customers, when I was in the industry, had great safety cultures. But there can be times when the customer puts pressure on our folks in the field to get the job done. And that can be interpreted as cutting corners. How do you deal with this, especially, when you come from a mindset that the customer's always right and you are trying to please the customer?
Yeah, not all customers carry the same safety risk and profile. The big mines tend to have strong safety culture and folks moving around, monitoring and engaging with the employees and the contractors on the bench or in the magazine areas. I think the bigger challenge is at the smaller operations or locations, construction jobs in particular, that don't have a strong safety culture, and that requires our employees to stand up for what is safe for them to do or where they can work. So solid support for these commitments to each one of them has to be done by us on a regular basis as leaders with the risk of losing the customer. And we have a phrase at Austin that it's not entirely unique or proprietary, but I think it's entirely appropriate, and that is safety is our priority. And we have many competing priorities on our time and our actions, and our folks need to know that when there is a conflict between those demands, that we always choose safety, and we will back you up every time.
That's a really important point. And, an enduring challenge for the industry. Which makes it all the more important to keep emphasizing safety as a first priority. I'd like to transition, John, now to kind of managing risk and what many people refer to as the hierarchy of controls. And that's just the notion that not all controls to manage a hazard are equally as effective. Those based on procedures and rules and policy tend to be weaker, for instance, than those of an engineering control or an interlock that can't be bypassed. And the very top of that pyramid for the highest level of control is actually just eliminating the hazard. And from our past conversations, John, I know this is something that you've given a lot of thought to. And you mentioned to me that drove your thought process on eliminating dynamite manufacturing from your operations. So can you talk a little bit about how you thought about eliminating a hazard versus choosing to control it?
Sure, happy to, Jeanne. Our industry is probably one of the slowest adapters of technology that is out there. And I say that both as a lighthearted joke, but also as a fact, just because of the nature of what we're dealing with. And we aren't recognized for making change quick, and that's partly because of everything we've been talking about. But in the case of dynamite, we know we can do better. Dynamite is not a new product. It's a product that's been around since 1870s. And when I started in the industry, there were probably, I'm guessing here, 50 dynamite plants around the world. Today, I can name maybe 5 or 6, with one of those just announcing recently its closure. So running a dynamite plant today, to do it safely, is getting harder and harder as the number of educated folks who understand the equipment, the process, the basis of safety of nitroglycerin or glycol, the details of how to do that safely, the technicians who make that equipment, the people who support it and work on it, etc., are just less and less. And so our industry is graying out, and the in-house and third-party resources that are used to support those past 50 plants are long gone. So from a manufacturing perspective, I've just turned the page that we don't have to make dynamite any longer. And second, we have an alternative product like emulsions that can be substituted to replace the dynamite. It's not easy in some cases, as dynamite is a great product for a host of reasons. But there are a few applications that this can't be done by an emulsion or another type of industrial explosive. So why risk it? We were making gelatin dynamite in Austria up until our plant detonated, killing 2 of our family members. And Austria was a dynamite country as a market. And after the detonation, we determined that we would not rebuild the dynamite plant, but we would rather invest into a latest emulsion technology. And with a lot of work and effort, today Austria has been converted 90% to emulsions. So finally, dynamites are much more impact sensitive than emulsions. And we talked about fish and the characteristics of what can cause detonations. So impact can come from an accident during transportation. It can come from a drill on a shot that is drilling into product that was unknowingly left from a previous blast. Or, as we hate to say these days, it could also come from a bullet. Emulsions, on the other hand, are very insensitive to impact, but they can still be made and transported and stored and used to do the same work that dynamite has been doing for decades.
That's a fabulous example, and it actually pulls in our next topic, which is really about going outside our individual organizations and thinking about advancing industry safety. You know, as president of Austin Powder, you've been using your passion to promote industry safety through industry stewardship responsibility in organizations like the IME, as well as, ensuring proper regulatory oversight for our industry. So can you explain your role and how you see this oversight and why you feel it's so important to industry safety?
Sure. I see our role as leaders in our industries to identify where we can improve or rise above what may be the existing legal structures or a particular jurisdiction. If we accept a particular standard in one country as a minimum for safe operations, shouldn't we be deploying that where we can operate globally? And that can be hard to do in some cases, since the local competition may have a completely different view on safety and product stewardship, for example. And so we can't do this alone, just as Austin Powder, and that's why we work through organizations like the IME or SafeX, and there are others around the world, so that we can engage with local governments to have well-written laws and regulations that are adopted by the industry. And this makes more sense than having an event happen and then having to react to all of the energies that descend upon a situation with lots of solutions and agendas. And a great example of this is in other countries where we may not have a well-articulated standard or table of distance, as we call it, for how much product can be stored at a particular site. And in this case, we often adopt and bring the IME's table of distances that are used here in the United States and share that with the local authorities as to why we are recommending this volume of product at this particular magazine site.
Yeah, thank you, John. And I think we can all relate, whichever industry we're in, to the imperative of going above the legal requirements in order to be safely operating. And I've always said that compliance is a necessary prerequisite, but it is not sufficient to ensure safety. I'd like to segue to your role as chairman of SafeX International, a global safety organization for the explosives industry. And I remember that you clearly understood the importance of leadership in that role and used your personal relationships and time to coerce or however you want to describe it, all the CEOs from the explosive companies to become personally involved in that organization. Can you explain a little bit about your thinking there and why you think that was so important?
Yeah, I was trying to recreate what I first saw when I joined the industry. And back then, Safex was the organization to really look up to. It was led by the CEOs of industry at that time, and it really had the buy-in from all of those leaders as to the mission, the scope, and importance of sharing safety knowledge with each other. The organization itself started back in the early 50s with the mission to help each other avoid another unplanned detonation. It was strongly oriented toward the European dynamite and detonator manufacturing companies after the war. And through much of the early years, it had a strong membership also from companies in South Africa and in Peru. My first Safex conference was right after the fatality that I described earlier. And so it was like going to church for me or finding my people where I could learn more. And it was there where I met a gentleman named Andy Begg, who's Safex's expert safety leader for the first time. And he quickly became my mentor and guide, and we're just great friends today. I've tried to direct Safex with this in mind, that we need to be the repository of knowledge to the greatest extent possible for the industrial explosives industry. We've had too much turnover in our industry's leadership today, and within the ranks of the various companies, as they get right-sized and stressed for quarterly earnings, each company, they handle these types of challenges differently. But Safex is, in my mind, the safe house for all explosives companies and member employees, including CEOs, where they can go to learn and study, meet industry experts, become mentees, and take the baton from the leaders of the past and into their companies and operations. And Safex has helped elevate me to share my voice and my experience not only within the industry, but also within Austin Powder, where I often tell folks, yes, so I am the CEO, but actually more importantly is I'm the Chief Safety Officer.
Yeah, I can agree with that. And this has been a truly fascinating discussion, and I'm sure you and we could talk for hours on this subject. But I want to wrap it up with one last question, because I think that one of the toughest parts about leading safety is kind of keeping these tough lessons that we've learned alive in ourselves and the organization, and making these safety messages really stick. You know, I don't know what it is, but it seems like as humans, we just seem to have a tough time keeping the intensity and the focus up over longer periods of time. So, John, do you have any pointers for the audience, things that work for you in keeping the mission alive, as you call it, your essence of purpose, and maintaining your level of commitment and passion?
I have two things. I'll go back to that first fatality where we were sitting in that family's living room in silence on the couch. And the only thing at that point in time that I heard was a pendulum clock on the wall that just was, counting time. And I've never forgot that moment, and I never want to. And so for years, I've placed on my desk at work a pendulum clock that whenever I have a lull or a moment of quiet, I'm reminded of my role at work and the task at hand. And I'm required to wind that one time a week because it has an 8-day spring. And that also just kind of reinforces the need to go back and make sure we're doing everything we need to do. And the second thing we do inside Austin Powder is we have a global safety meeting online on Teams that anyone can join. And I try to join it every week. It's just fascinating for me to get to see how people are sharing their knowledge, sharing their learnings, the near misses, the corrective actions. And I think that's just a great way every week to address these serious topics.
Yeah, some great pointers there, as well as you can really envision you winding that clock every week. A great way to honor that fateful day. And actually a great way to conclude this podcast. So I want to thank you, John, for your time today, and more importantly, for sharing your passion for keeping people safe and managing operating risk in a high-hazard industry such as explosives. So thank you, John.
Well, thank you, Jeanne. It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, stay safe.
Pilco & Associates is the leading advisor to officers and boards on operational EHS and ESG risks and liabilities in the global chemical and energy industries. With 45 years of experience, the The firm advises on driving rapid, dramatic and sustainable improvements in safety, reliability and competitiveness. Hilco's advisors have an average of 38 years of relevant professional experience in operational and executive roles with major energy and chemical companies. For more information, go to www.pilco.com.